Righty, thank you everyone for coming to listen today. So this time I'm going to be talking about climate change and where it's come from. Is it a thing? What can we do about it? And how should we as Christians consider that as well? It's got a little thought there to think about being the change that we might want to see in this world. All right, so this is an outline we're going to look at today. So we'll have a look at whether humans are causing climate change. It's very, very tricky to prove conclusively per se, but we'll have a look at the data and what that might say. And we'll have a little refresher on correlation and causation and what that looks like. And then we'll have a look at key climate change issues. So what about the modern lifestyle kind of presents these big issues that we're worried that we might be seeing. And we'll have a look at the Christian response and what can we do? What is the solution? All right, so is the climate even changing to begin with? So that's step one. Who cares about what humans are doing if nothing's even happening? So there are a number of kind of climate change indicators we can look at that scientists tend to share, and we're going to have a look at some examples of each of these. It's going to look at surface temperatures of the Earth, the ocean as well, their temperatures. Sea levels tied into that, acidity of the ocean, so whether it's acidic, the volume of the polar ice caps, how big they are, whether they're shrinking or growing, then the number of extreme weather events as well. So let's start with the old global surface temperature change. And so this is a graph done by the International something or other climate change. So it's a whole bunch of governments getting together to do a big report with all the data that they've got. And so in the gray, you can see the data that we have. This is what we've measured. Excuse me, and these colored lines are projections based on this in the future. And so these are different projections based on different scenarios. And so you can see even the best case one down here in the light blue. We're still going to see a fair bit of warming yet. So this is another 0.5 degree Celsius on average. Doesn't sound like much, but we'll have a look at that later. So even that it's going to continue to go, and then maybe we can drag it down if we were to make some change. And here's what the line will continue to do at this rate if we weren't making a lot of change at all. And so you can see by the end of this century, they're projecting a 5 degree average temperature change, which is massive. So that's all extrapolation. That's based on a future prediction, but we can see here there's a clear trend of increase, at least in the last few decades for sure. So next is sea surface temperatures. And so this one looks like a lightning bolt zigzag. And the reason for that is this is yearly data. So I've got from the 80s through to around about now at the bottom. And this is the highs and the lows because of seasonal variation, when summer's warmer and winter is cooler. And so if you were to remove all this seasonal variation, we actually do this in year 12 maths, I teach in my class. If you remove that variation, you can see this trend line in the middle. So it kind of removes all the seasonal change noise, and you can see the underlying trend that's kind of buried in the data there. And as you can see, while it's slight, this underlying trend is going up over time. And even just taking a step back to look at the big picture, you can see that the peaks and the troughs, they do tend to be trending up a little bit slightly. So again, not just the air temperature, but we're seeing the sea temperatures increasing over time, and that's been a trend clear through the last few decades. And so this is one example from the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean is warming, but there's oodles of ocean data around the world that shows similar signs here. All right, so next one is CO2 emissions from fossil fuels by world region. So we talk about CO2 being a key driver, and carbon emissions as being a key driver for climate change. And so we haven't looked at that link just yet, but you can see that clearly we are just dumping a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. And so if that is a problem, it's going to be a big problem because look at its growth. And so this is, you can see over the last century, it's just gone out of control. And you can see the different kind of contributors to that, whether they're individual countries or like Europe, what are they, a continent, and those sorts of things as well. And so you can see that we're making efforts to reduce our CO2 emissions. And so some are actually going down, but some are growing as they grow and get bigger, and trends within their individual country as well. So clearly we're putting out lots more CO2. So if CO2 is a problem, this is going to be a big problem. All right, next is ocean acidification. So this is how acidic the ocean is. And so we measure acidity and alkaline, acid and alkaline, the opposites, on a pH scale. So they're on the right-hand side, I've got the pH scale. So a lower number indicates that it's more acidic. And I've got a few things plotted on the graph here. And so the red line here is going up. That's atmospheric CO2. So that's what we saw on the previous page. It's well, let me click back. But on the previous page from our carbon emissions, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is going up. So from 1958 to now about-ish, it's gone from, what's that, about 315, 320, and it's up past 400 at this point. So more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere results in a lower pH in the ocean. And the reason for that is CO2, when it mixes with acid, with water, produces an acid, carbonic acid. And so that's why your Coca-Cola is acidic, because it has that dissolved carbon dioxide bubbles in it. And that makes the water slightly acidic, and that's why it rots your teeth along with the sugar. And so because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, the ocean's pH, we can clearly see, is going down as the CO2 goes up here. And the amount of CO2 in the ocean itself is going up too. So it's not just the air that's being affected. We can see here clearly that the amount of carbon dioxide is also present in the ocean, increasing amounts, and therefore we get this decrease on the pH scale. And so it's not just the carbon as well. And so this is aragonite saturation in the ocean surface. And so you can see that that's increasing as well in different parts around the world. And so this is the last 100 years or so too. And so it's showing that other substances beyond just carbon are also kind of increasing this effect as well. And these are caused by humans as well, through other things that we're doing to the environment. All right, and then last one here, it's taken up my whole page, I'll hide over here. So this is mass change in polar ice caps. And so on the left here, we have a change in gigatons, giga being a billion. So this is billions of tons, thousands of billions of tons. So like a lot of stuff. And so over time, it's going negative. So that means we're having a negative mass change, which means the polar ice caps are getting smaller over time. And so this is only from the last few decades. You can see we're seeing the significant drop off in polar ice caps in different frozen regions. And this is contributed to, on the right-hand side, to sea level contribution. So this is only in millimeters, not meters, thankfully. But because we are losing so much ice, it's actually raising the surface of the ocean. And we've got a clear trend happening, and presumably the driver for this might be increased average temperature of the Earth like we saw before. And then lastly, we have extreme weather, extreme weather events. So again, this is the last few decades. It's broken down into droughts, fires, heat waves, floods, storms, and cold events as well. And we're seeing a pretty clear trend that in recent years, we're seeing much more of extreme weather events, and we're seeing all sorts of weather events. We're not just seeing heat waves as the Earth heats. We're seeing floods, we're seeing storms, we're seeing droughts, we're seeing cold as well. And so we'll talk a little bit later about why that's linked. But essentially, weather is driven by temperature, whether that's temperature going up or down. And so any change is going to upset the delicate balance that we see in our weather patterns. And as we can see that the temperature is slightly changing, we're seeing a change in the extreme weather events that result from that. All righty, so we've looked at a bunch of graphs with things going up. What does that mean? So we've spoken in a previous video about correlation and causation. So that's the idea that if things are connected, if they show up at the same time in the same place, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is causing the other. So people buying air conditioning units doesn't mean that ice cream sales go up, even though they're connected. There's a third variable there in the temperature. So when it's hot, people buy ice creams and air conditioning units, but ice creams don't cause air conditioning. And so it's possible that all these things are not related. It's possible that we're just seeing them in the same time in the same place as a fluke. And so to conclude that climate change is caused by these things and in turn caused by humans, we need to study carefully while controlling for other factors, as well as identifying a clear mechanism by which this could occur. And so So it is what it is. The data says what it is. I guess it's up to you to determine what you think from that. The scientific community as a whole, they're largely in agreement that carbon emissions are causing that temperature increase. So we see that link between lots of carbon emissions, lots of temperature and change. And they've identified a clear mechanism by which this can occur, the greenhouse effect. So we're not just seeing the same time, the same place. We have a clear link by which one might cause the other. And so this is the greenhouse effect. And so it's called that because it functions like a greenhouse where we grow our plants in. And so the idea is that as the sun's rays, heat and radiation come into the earth, they pass through our atmosphere, they hit the surface of the earth, and some of those are reflected or absorbed and re-emitted into our atmosphere. And so a whole bunch of it bounces off, goes back into space, see you later, it's gone forever. But our atmosphere actually works to trap a lot of that heat radiation. And so you can see here that it bounces back off the atmosphere, it hangs around. And so as the sun continues to put out energy and we continue to absorb it, if we're not getting rid of enough, the only thing that can happen is we can continue to heat up over time. And so this is what scientists fear that we're seeing. And the reason that we fear this is because CO2 is a potent greenhouse gas. It's very good at absorbing heat and energy from the sun and trapping it in the atmosphere. And so any heat that's passing through that stuff isn't going to escape very easily. And the more of that we pump into our atmosphere, the more stuff there is to capture and retain that heat and cause that average temperature increase over time. So we've got a clear connection. We also have a cause by which one might be causing the other. And so this is why scientists strongly feel that the climate is changing because of emissions. And we know that we are causing a lot of emissions and we're probably doing this problem ourselves. And so on those graphs, there's lots of numbers and stuff, but hey, the temperature's only gone up by 1 degree. It's only going to go up by 5 degrees in the next few decades. So who cares? What's the big deal? And so this is the reason that we care about small changes. And so this is what we call a bell curve. We call it that because it's a curve that looks like a bell. And so what this means is it represents a normal distribution. And so what it means is we see lots of average things. So the higher this is means the more of stuff we see. So we see lots of, if you think about the heights of people, we see lots of people of average height. Then over here on the left, we don't see many short people. And over here on the right, we don't see as many tall people. So that's how a normal distribution works. And our temperature and weather systems are the same. Most of the time, the temperature is average. Sometimes it gets really cold. Sometimes it gets really hot. But the scary thing about a bell curve is when you start to move it sideways. And so I've got cold on the left and hot on the right. And so if I was to take this whole bell curve and move it along just a little bit, not changing its shape, just moving it to the right, we can see that happening as a temperature increase here. And so this is what we're seeing on the graphs. We know that the average temperature of the Earth is increasing and moving to the right. And so what you'll see here is while even with a small change here, while the averages tend to stay the same, we actually see a huge swing in the extremes. So maybe I'd only get a little bit of the really super duper extreme hot weather events here. But if I move my bell curve to the right, because this flattens off so dramatically, if this is the average temperature here, we now see this much larger section, which is now accessible to us as an Earth. And so not only does it mean our extreme weather events get hotter total, it also means they happen more often. And that's because of the shape of this curve and that dramatic drop off. So we go from a teeny tiny percentage of the time to a bigger percentage of the time. And some of it's even nastier on top of that. And so because of that bell curve shape, even a small change from the left to the right because of temperature results in huge dramatic changes at either end. And that's why we need to care about these small changes, because these small changes in the middle moving across have a huge effect on the fringes. And these are the ones that we're scared of. These are the ones that kill people and ruin our livelihoods. And so that's what we need to be worried about. All right, so we've talked about the idea that, yep, so emissions are probably linked to rise in temperature, and even a small rise in temperature does matter. It's something we need to be concerned about. And so if we want to look at this more closely as a result, we need to consider how our modern lifestyles may be contributing to these carbon emissions and all these different things. And so most emissions are tied to things that we do every day, unfortunately, and these are the big ones. So the first one is transport. If I want to drive to work, I need to burn some dead dinosaurs to do that in my fuel tank. If I want to turn on the lights and have electricity, okay, that's electricity, that's nice and clean, except it was made by burning some dirty coal over at the power plant. And even farming produces a lot of greenhouse gases because, yeah, they have farming equipment and you transport stuff. But the actual the actual act of farming itself produces greenhouse gases. So I've got burps and farts here. So livestock, particularly cattle, cows, they do a whole bunch of burps and farts as they chew on the grass and they turn that into meat. They actually produce a very potent greenhouse gas called methane, which is much, much, much more potent than carbon dioxide. And because we have so much cattle, because people are eating so much meat, this is actually a big contributor in of itself. And then there's manufacturing. When we make stuff, we produce more carbon emissions, particularly with concrete, steel, and plastics. And so that's not boohoo all the things we do, because obviously the modern lifestyle is nice. We like doing it. We live longer, we have better education, we've got more income, we actually have time and money for leisure. That's a thing that not all people have through history. And so this is great. I'm not promoting a move back to the Stone Age, but we do need to consider what we're doing and how we can do things a little bit smarter. So let's have a look. So in terms of making stuff, steel is a big one. And so to make steel, we take iron and we put some carbon in it. And talking carbon emissions, our ears should be pricking up here already. And so the way we produce steel in a process like this is we get iron ore and we melt it, which contains oxygen, as well as iron, of course. And we cook it at a high temperature and we add coke, which is a type of coal, which is coal, which is basically carbon. And so we mix our iron and our carbon together to make our steel. But there's also oxygen in that iron ore. And so the carbon comes from the carbon and connects with the oxygen from the iron ore. And that creates CO2, so carbon and two oxygens. And so that creates a greenhouse gas through that chemical reaction. And so through this chemical reaction, at the end of the day, we get 1 ton of steel. And for every ton of steel we get 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide. And so the very act of making steel itself causes carbon dioxide, carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So every time we make steel, more greenhouse gas and that potential link to temperature. Next one is concrete. You wouldn't think concrete was a big one as well, but this is how we make concrete because cement is derived from limestone. So that's a mineral found in the ground. It's mostly calcium carbonate, which is calcium and CO3. And so if you see some C's and O's, you're probably thinking already, okay, we're going to have another problem here as well. And so we need to burn this limestone to produce cement. This produces calcium oxide, which is what we want, but we also get carbon dioxide as a result. So for every ton of cement we have 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So at least this one's even rather than imbalanced, but every time we make cement, we're contributing to greenhouse emissions as well. All right, so making stuff is a problem. Plastics can produce carbon emissions too, but because they're carbon-based, sometimes we actually trap some carbon in there. So while carbons get a bad rap environmentally with breaking down, they can actually be a route by which we might trap carbon, which can be good too. But let's have a look at renewables because we know that renewables are one potential answer to help us to manage this situation. And so a key one, the key two are solar and wind. We've heard lots about these. But the issue with these is that they're unreliable. So solar obviously only works at the daytime when we have the sun. And not only that, it only works when the weather is nice, when it's not too cloudy, it's not raining, and the sun can actually contact with the panels. And then for winds too, obviously relying on winds, and that's unreliable. And so it limits us to the locations that we can do this. You only want to put solar panels in pretty sunny places. You only want to put wind turbines in windy locations. And so while you can be smart about that and do that, that's fine. It causes a lot of issues in terms of transporting electricity because it's difficult to transport electricity over distances. So if I've got a big city over here, which is taking lots of electricity and my wind is over here, I need to, it's going to be a big investment, but also a lossy process to get the electricity from here to here, because every time you transport electricity in a power line, some of it gets lost through resistance, that's heat. And so just moving electricity causes a loss there. It's not very efficient. And so on top of that, we're not even very good at storing electricity. And so if I wanted to run things off solar, that's great. I get all my daytime power, and then I'm going to turn the lights off at night because I've got no electricity left from solar. And so for that to work, we need a way to store electricity. We need huge, very effective batteries at a low cost. And we are not even close to doing this. It sounds like an easy thing, but it's not. It's only in recent years that Tesla has developed some batteries that you can stick on the side of your house to keep your, to kind of store your solar so you can use it at night and that sort of thing. And those sorts of products are 10 grand or more just for one battery for one house. And that's a very small scale thing, let alone powering a whole city. And so in terms of battery technology and storage, we are not even close to being able to do that. It's very difficult to transport a long way. And even if we do, we lose a whole bunch of it and it's expensive. And if you're in a place like Europe, it gets even trickier because if you're talking about putting power lines across borders, it gets very political. Like who pays that infrastructure, who maintains it, who should profit from it, who should it go to and where and when. So it gets very political very quickly as well. And then the last thing to consider is land use. You actually need a whole bunch of land for all these solar panels and a whole bunch of land for all these wind turbines. I'm going to look at a graphic later in terms of how much land footprint it requires. And eventually, if our electricity costs continue to go up, we're not going to have enough space to do it using these technologies without some large breakthroughs. And so this is all explained really well by a guy called, he has a YouTube channel called Real Engineering. He's got this lovely soothing Irish accent, lots of fantastic videos, well researched, very listenable. So I'll put a link to that in there. You're most welcome to have a look, they're great. All right, so this is projected land use intensity in 2030. So this is how much land we use to get things happening. And so you can see that actually wind's not too bad here. It's down at 72. It's not the absolutely massive one. Where's solar? Solar's there too. And so while that bar doesn't seem too big, you will see it is much larger than the ones we use now, like natural gas or coal or nuclear, that sort of stuff. So while it looks small, it is still much larger than the ways we tend to produce electricity now. And if we want to go the biomass in terms of like burning biological waste, and so using a waste product to produce electricity, they use a huge amount of land because they're based on farming, which we know uses a lot of land here. And so while they're great, it's not going to be sustainable in how much space we need, especially as land tends to have a lot of value and price tag attached to it. And then there's geothermal there, which looks pretty good. That's basically using heat underground from the earth and its molten core to make power. But I don't know, does that count? They're digging straight down. I feel like that's a lot of land, but just in that direction instead of sideways. All right, so next one is energy generation too. So nuclear is an option that kind of gets touted in terms of being clean because it doesn't actually produce any carbon emissions, basically any at all. A bit of concrete to put it together, obviously, but once you do that, it's just nuclear fuel and water. Like there's no carbon being produced along the way. And so while that's clean, people worry about the dangers, nuclear meltdowns, all that kind of stuff. And so while those things are absolutely horrifying in terms of nuclear meltdowns and how that can go wrong, in terms of the statistics overall, it's not much of a worry at all, as you can see here. And so this is the death rates from energy production per terawatt hour. We can see that coal kills way more people than anything else. Nuclear is down here, barely rating a bar, and obviously our other renewables are looking good here. And so this is deaths from accidents and air pollution. So obviously a nuclear accident's really bad, but coal plants have accidents too because it's a combustible. But once you factor in air pollution, particularly in places like China, we see so much more of a health impact from coal than we do from something like nuclear. And so that's an argument that we could use to move towards some more cleaner methods like nuclear, as long as we're able to comfortably deal with the waste. And there are a lot of new technologies which are recycling that waste, which is really cool to see. Alrighty, so we've talked about a whole bunch of stuff. What's going wrong? What can we do about it? The next question is, well, what should we do about it? And so I want to talk about the Christian response, how we might think about that as Christians. And so anecdotally, I've known some Christians be pretty blasé about it. So like, Revelation says the world's going to end anyway. That doesn't really matter what I do. I guess that's true. Only he knows the day or the hour of that. But it's pretty clear that we have a responsibility along the way as well. So firstly, in 2 Peter 3:10, it says, the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Who knows when? But the elements will melt with fervent heat. That sounds like global warming. And the earth and its works will be burned up as well. So this earth is not going to hang around. According to the Bible, that's quite clear in 2 Peter and some other letters as well as Revelation. So we're not going to live here forever. We don't need to worry about flying to Mars. I hope not. But we still need to look over this earth, look after it while we're here. So right in the beginning, Genesis 1, the first chapter of the Bible, it says that we have dominion over the fish and sea and the birds in the air and over every living thing that comes upon the earth. We're called to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so we're the boss of earth while we're here pretty much. And so God's given that responsibility to us. And so for us to trash the place isn't filling that responsibility. And so I think Genesis 1 is pretty clear that we as Christians should have a responsibility to the earth that we live in, to protect us, to protect the animals, and to ensure that our descendants have a future that's not wrecked by extreme weather events and all sorts of other issues. And then lastly, in Mark, it says, Jesus was asked about what are the most important commands. He says, love the God with all your heart and all your soul. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these. And so to be loving to others, we need to look after the place we're in as well. So I think it's pretty clear that we have responsibility to the earth in that we're responsible for it. We have dominion and we need to love others. To love others, we need to not wreck the place that they're going to call home. And so in my opinion, based on these verses, the Christian response should be that, we should do our bit to contribute in terms of keeping this earth to be a safer place. And so I've got a graphic here. Climate change is not something I've felt too strongly about for over the years necessarily, but I think this cartoon is brilliant. It's been a favorite of mine for a very long time. So what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world and it's all for nothing? And so for me, that makes it a no-brainer. Regardless of your opinion on climate change and what that looks like and how it works, a lot of this stuff is just good for us to do anyway. We're eventually going to run out of coal, so we're going to need to come up with something else anyway. Might as well do it now. And if we're worried that there's some danger, even better reason to do it now. So I think it's pretty clear that taking action is a good thing to do. So with that in mind, what in the world can we do? And so obviously we're talking big changes. We all need to do this together. So it needs to happen at 3 levels. One is with us. What can we do? Next is industry and businesses and how they do their practices, because we have some huge businesses on this earth now that have a huge footprint. Facebook has more users in most countries, all sorts of stuff like that. And then obviously governments as well, because they represent entire nations. And so while we are just individuals, we can only worry about ourselves to an extent. We can actually help to drive the actions and behavior of industry and government by our action and behavior. As voters, we can influence the government. And as consumers, we can influence business by taking our money elsewhere if they're not doing what we think is the right thing to do. And so obviously we need a lot of inventions. We need a lot of innovation to do this. We need people to come up with new technologies that are renewable, more efficient, safer, all that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean we can just leave it to the boffins and the science labs. We also need to think about demand, because all they can do is produce a product and there's a supply. But if people don't want that thing and it's irrelevant, that invention will never, ever matter unless people want it. So we need to consider demand as well. And so the way that we can do that is us as consumers, we can, choose something that's renewable, choose something that's safer, choose something with lower emissions when we make our purchases. So that's a choice that we make in order to demand those sorts of things. But we can also cause demand changes in the market with government subsidies, for example. So maybe a government might, put a small amount of cash into making something more desirable in the market. So in Australia, we've seen examples of that with solar panels. So there's government subsidies for having them installed and the rebates on the power and all that sort of stuff. And so consumers flocked to that. It seemed like everyone had a solar panel on their roof. And so demand was increased by changing the economics when a government was able to step in and do that. And so secondly, like a government, large buyers can commit to doing something new. So instead of using rotten coal, they might commit to buying a biofuel instead. Maybe Qantas could fly using biofuels, that sort of stuff. And so by having these large buyers committing large amounts of money to demand a large amount of these products, that's obviously going to reduce emissions, but it's also kind of permission for everyone else to jump on board as well and to get into that thing. And obviously it's going to become cheaper. It's going to become the norm. And that'll be better for everyone, assuming it is a good thing for the earth to do that. And then obviously we have to invest in that research to begin with, because whatever we can do to reduce things at the beginning, that'll reduce the cost down the line, because investors will be wanting to recoup the cost for any new technology that they invest in. And so I read a book recently called How to Avoid a Climate Change Disaster. It's written by Bill Gates in 2021. Yep, it's the Microsoft guy. Very smart guy. He reads like a Canvas Woolies bag of all sorts of books every week. He just consumes information. And he's spent the last couple of decades trying to put his money to good use and working with the experts and learning a lot about how to do that. And so it's very well thoughtful, and he's good at communicating that. I highly recommend that book. There's a preview there as well if you'd like to have a look. Alrighty, so we've got a plan. We reckon it's a good idea. Things are going wrong, but even still, this stuff takes time. And so what I've got here is timelines of new technologies and how long it took for new technologies or energy sources to take over. And so when coal became a big deal in 1840s, thereabouts, you can still see that it took about 60 years for it to produce 40% of global energy supply. Then the same with crude oil. When we started moving to cars and all that sort of stuff from 1915 onwards, again, it took about 50 years to provide 30% of global energy supply. And then natural gas had its big boom a little time after. But you can see it just takes so long for these technologies to be taken up on a big scale. And so with renewables, we're here. We're right at the bottom. Another 50, 60 years, we might be able to get to 30, 40%, or even more if we can be really intentional about it. But whatever we do, it is going to take time. You know, we're driving a big oil tanker. We see an iceberg up ahead. It takes time to turn that thing away from danger. So it's important that we act now rather than leaving it to later if we are concerned. All right, so that about covers it. We looked at the stats about whether humans might be causing climate change. We saw correlations and we saw a causative link, which might suggest that is the reason for that. We looked at how the modern lifestyle kind of connects into that, and some of the issues that we have in terms of moving to renewables and safer technologies. And we had a look at the Christian response and kind of the responsibility that we have to this earth and to others on it. And then we had a look at the different things we can do as individuals to be part of the solution. And so as always, got some references here if you're interested in this. So I've got references to a lot of that data and links. There's a lot of detailed reports here as well in terms of understanding those different aspects. And that Real Engineering YouTube one's got a lot of great videos about why things are the way they are from economical and engineering aspects. But as always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time.